So do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm mostly an engineer, but I've done a bunch of other bits and pieces, and I helped start the Mozilla project quite a while ago. And I've been affiliated one way or another ever since. And I really, over the last however many years it is now, I guess it's more than 15, it's about 17 years ago we started Mozilla. My sort of perspective on how software development works and can work and works best has changed a lot, in the sense that I went from an extremely naive point of view to one that is at least marginally more enlightened. And I feel like one of the things that I really picked up along the way was the idea of retrospectives and how they work, and it feels to me like that's sort of helped me and the teams that I've been working with in recent years really get better substantially faster, and set up a sort of a framework where it's easier for us to work together. So that's maybe a good start.
Cool, awesome. So when did you first start using the retrospective, and how big was the team, or what was kind of the situation?
So I started using it probably 4 or 5 years ago, and this was mostly just me and another guy. And there were maybe a couple other people who were sort of in and out of our project. We were working on an ill-fated gaming framework called Gladius for Mozilla. And it didn't really go anywhere. But one of the things that we were doing sort of for the first time was trying out a bunch of the agile techniques. And so I was sort of given some pointers from a friend of mine, a guy named William Petrie, who's very, very good at this stuff. And he suggested I check out some questions that came from Norm Kurth, and so I sort of took those. And me and this other guy would just get together every week, and we'd talk our way through these questions and sort of help figure out what we would do, well, how we would answer them. And it's probably, but how, I guess it's going to be a lot more useful to talk about it less abstract. So the 4 questions that we would ask ourselves each time would be, what did we do well? What have we learned? What puzzles us? And this is sort of an interesting foil question. And before that is actually, what could we have done better? And that's actually, the foil question. So really what this is all about, and what it's been about for me, is providing a cadence of being a little bit introspective and saying, so like, how are we working? Like, what are our processes actually like? I don't like process. Process is, for me, kind of annoying, except for the fact that it turns out to be incredibly helpful when you have really good process, and an incredible hindrance when you have bad process. So I could go through the questions, might be the easiest way.
Let's unpack those questions. And by the way, are those the 4 questions from the guide Norm that you read?
There's some derivative. I don't actually know.
Yeah.
I originally I took them from Norm Kurth, and my friend may have evolved them a bit, and I know that we've evolved them a bit, the teams that I've been working on since then, just to sort of see what helped us the most. And this is where we've landed for now. I think there's a lot more space we could try.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the first question of what did we do well is really, and you guys should just jump in and holler at any time if you have ideas or suggestions or your experiences of like why things work a certain way, or things that I've forgotten, or things I'm totally wrong about, which it turns out happens far too much. But what did we do well is really a nice way to give ourselves credit. Because one of the things that I found I was doing, and a fair number of folks that I was working with were doing over the years, was we were just focusing on, well, we've got all this work to do. Like, it's all in front of us, right? And one of the things that we sort of hadn't realized is that paying attention to it and really giving ourselves credit for the stuff that we've just done makes us feel really empowered and really allows us to say, all right, now we can do the next stuff, as opposed to just feeling kind of overwhelmed because, well, look at that mountain of shit to do. So that's sort of relatively self-explanatory. The next one is, what have we learned this week? And that's kind of nice because it forces us to reflect a little bit around like what's new, and also oftentimes like something that would be new to one person wouldn't even be known to the other person. And so just the act of talking about it would sort of be like, oh yeah, hey, that's a really good idea, or oh, so that's how you debug that kind of thing. And it's it's more context, I think, for the stuff that comes next. And the one that comes next is, what could we do better? And this is sort of an odd question, because what it's intended to do is say, what could we do better that we already know how to execute? Like, we just dropped the ball on it. Like, we didn't keep track of our velocity this week, and like, we didn't do a good job of assigning points to bugs, and boy, that sucked, but we know how to do that. But one of the things that happens almost every time it gets asked is a bunch of people will say, well, we should have shipped our localization stuff better. And that's completely undefined, and we don't really know what that means. But one of the things that this gives us the opportunity to do is sort of say, all right, that's not really something that we know how to do that we can do better. That's something that puzzles us. And so you sort of boot it on to the next category. And then the puzzles us one is really interesting for me, because it's one of the things about it is that you're allowed to just leave shit on the table. Like, you're allowed to say, this puzzles me, and then like people maybe talk about it, people maybe don't have too much to say about it, and you move on. But this, to me, feels especially important, because one of the things that happens in lots and lots of other meetings that I've been parts of is the messenger gets punished. When somebody says, oh yeah, there's this problem there with the way we're doing our code reviews, and then somebody else says, okay, so why don't you own fixing that? And that doesn't really make you want to speak up very much about problems if you're going to be forced to own the thing. And so I think that itself is really a big deal. But the other thing that it does is, and I'm still trying to incorporate new wording into this question, I feel like, because one of the things is that people, it's often sort of helpful and interesting to just sort of ruminate on what puzzles us, this particular thing, and what's wrong, and what can we do, and all this stuff. But the thing that's I found most useful is what are some small experiments we could try to make it a little bit better? And this sort of goes in cadence with the fact that, well, the whole thing is a cadence of, you have your retrospective every week. And so this gives you sort of a chance to try things without just saying, oh, well, that's broken. We're going to change our process, and that'll fix it. And if that goes sideways, well, shit. And so I could dig into that more, but maybe I've rambled a bit here.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really good. You mentioned the cadence, and that was one thing I was going to ask is, because you have this continuous improvement thing of checking in, was it once a week?
Yeah, we still do it once a week, yeah.
Yeah. So do you ever pull back and go, like, at the end of a month or a quarter, like a meta retrospective where you see patterns, or do you document?
Sometimes we'll do that at the end of projects. I'm not sure if we've done it enough. I don't know. Have other people in here been involved in retrospectives very much in the past? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Like, is
frequency?
Well, more in the meta question, because I feel like
meta, yeah.
I feel like at least in the groups that I've been working with, we haven't totally worked out the best way to do that.
Do you? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
One thing that we ask all those questions, and there's action items.
Yeah.
Action items for the recording. So someone says they also include action items, but
yeah. Well, so we've been doing something that's sort of similar to that, which I kind of left out, which is at the very beginning of a retrospective, we review the experiments that are in flight. So usually there's somewhere between 2 and 5 process experiments in flight from the last week. And so what often happens is in the what puzzles us sections, we'll say, well, we could try, ask 3 people for a code review and just hope that one of them picks it up quickly. And let's just try that for a week and see how it goes. And so every week we review the list of stuff, and a certain amount of the time we say, okay, that worked pretty well. Let's just declare that a success and keep doing it. A certain amount of the time we just say, we don't really know yet. We're going to do it for another week. And a certain amount of the time we're like, yeah, that's not really been working. And so then we either try and think of something else, or we just move on and assume that if it's an important problem, it will come back. But yeah, so more thoughts?
So once we tried something a little different, but it's basically...
So what length of sprints was that about?
We have 2 weeks sprints.
All right. And did you know, like, do you have, I'm really curious about...
So we would have, like, I don't know, I guess some people...
And what kind of insight did you feel like that sort of percolated up, or?
I mean, it was curious to see when people were more stressed out.
This is all one document. It is a long scrolling Google Doc. And so we copy the template from the bottom every week to the top. We copy forward the 3 or 5 experiments that we want to carry forward. And at the very, very top, we actually have a successful experiments list just because we find that that's pretty motivating. Pretty much. I mean, mostly I've been running the retrospectives, but it's not really that firm. And so like if I'm not there, other people run them, and some weeks other people run them anyway. And it's the format sort of helps us track them, because the first 5 minutes is really go through each bullet point in the reviews, review the experiments in progress, and then decide what to do about it. And so occasionally we'll even say, yeah, this thing has been on our review queue as sort of a reminder for 5 weeks now, and it's making no progress at all. This is not the place to progress this. And then somebody can either decide to pick it up, or we just eject it summarily so that it doesn't screw up our retrospective process too.
How big is your team, Dan? Sorry.
Our team is probably on the order of 10 to 12 at the moment. Yeah,
2 pizza rolls.
that's right. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. The first one,
I've heard a lot of different theories on this, including some people who say that the modern thinking is that sprints are a little bit obsolete, and once you get to a certain point, you just want to keep going and have regular retrospectives. But I don't have a lot of expertise there. Like, I've always done 1 and 2 week sprints, and certainly I've always done the retrospectives on the 1 week cadence, which to me feels about right, because it feels like by the end of the week, you're starting to forget the stuff you cared about at the beginning of the week. And by the end of 2 weeks, a bunch of stuff is just gone. So, I mean, the
Constructive
biggest,
feedback.
yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that we try to do, I think, is we try to focus on the actions, the actions that were taken, regardless of who took them, and what happened around them, and not really talk about who did what when we're in that kind of feedback. And part of it, too, though, is it's really important in a retrospective to build up trust so that people can actually feel like that it's safe to say stuff that can be a little bit critical. And some of that, I think, comes from the puzzled section, like the fact that we're willing to admit that we're puzzled rather than having to pretend that we just, well, we know this shit, we'll fix it. And I think some of this, too, comes from the what we did well, because I think that creates a more sort of confident and comfortable atmosphere, as opposed to, we're back on our heels, shit, we gotta fix this. And like one of the things that I try and do that's not as many other people in the team do, and I'm not quite sure what to make of this, is for stuff and what we did well, like to specifically call out people and thank them for things that they did well. Like when we landed this one thing and this one guy drove it, it's like, dude, thanks, that's fantastic.
So it's personal when it's positive.
Right. And impersonal
Yeah.
when it's right. I think that's right.
When it's, yeah. Did you have one and then a couple more back there?
So mine's more of a request. You said
Yes, I could do that.
that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'll have to figure
we'll
out.
We'll have to figure out how.
Where
Is
to put that.
You kind of stole one quick question, then we'll definitely get to those. But it touches on a question. You mentioned like some things to avoid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like calling someone out on,
Right.
Are there other things that you would avoid or caution against when doing a retrospective?
I don't know. Nothing,
Ways to
nothing
keep it going
jumps to
still.
mind,
Yeah.
but I feel like the teams that I've done retrospectives with have all managed to build up a good level of trust such that we didn't spend a lot of time wandering around in retrospective pain. Like people found the retrospectives pretty valuable and seemed to be able to open up during them.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't one of the problems we happened to hit.
Yeah. Okay, there's there, and then one more in the back, I think, but go for it. Yeah.
So I've been in a lot of various.
So I'm gonna waffle. I'm gonna do some really good waffling on the answer to that one. Oh yeah, repeating the question. So one of the points was these can be pretty weighty questions, and so how can they, what's a good level of time? Since if things are too long, people tend to get distracted and lose focus. If it's short, you tend to miss key stuff. What's a good length of time? And so I'm going to take a little digression into the way our process happens to work, which is we have a very, very distributed team. So what we actually do is at the beginning of our meeting, it's this fantastic thing. Everyone shows up, and there's basically silence as everyone types in their bullet points answers to these questions. And then after they're all in, after 5 minutes or something, I or somebody else like, all right, we're probably ready. We're pretty much done, and nobody hollers, which they almost never do. Then we go down the list, and each person sort of talks us through the thing that they wrote up there, the things that they wrote up there as we hit them. And so I feel like 45 minutes is really comfortable and works well, especially when things are pretty stable. When things are changing a lot, it tends to go a lot longer, or it can go a lot longer if you don't just cut it off. And so like right now, we're probably at an hour and 15 minutes, which feels too long. Like I don't like it, but it also feels like we have a lot to talk about. So I have been in retrospectives in the past where what happened was it took an hour and 15 minutes, and the reason was sort of towards the end of it, people started rat-holing on stuff that wasn't really that important or doing really deep dives or whatever. And so at those points, we were like, all right, we could just call this. But that's sort of what I know.
Was
Sure.
there one more in the back before? There you go.
Yeah, how do you, when you're coming up with
So the question was, how do we parcel out the action items and the experiment management among different people as they happen? And so we don't have a Scrum Master, so it's very organic with us. And it's sort of this mix where oftentimes it's sort of apparent who should own it. Like the person that runs the meeting, typically it makes sense to have them take the thing that involves changing the process of their meeting for a little bit. And then there's other stuff where we get volunteers, and then sometimes there's stuff that nobody wants to take. And sometimes somebody will ask someone else to take it, like sometimes the manager will, and sometimes we'll just let it fall off. Like if it's not important enough and people aren't motivated enough to do it, and we're not willing to ask someone to do it, then let's see if it comes back.
Selection.
sort of a question?
So when you say, so the question, as I understand it, is how do we track the extra work of process changes?
Yeah, I mean, are you just, in terms of whatever system you're working for, you mentioned a Google Doc.
Right.
Are you tracking all of your work in a Google Doc, or do you have something like Jira separately?
No, we have, this leads to a variety of sort of semi-related answers. How do we track our stuff in general? And so the short answer is we don't track the time spent very closely on very much. At one point, we were actually doing a substantial amount of estimation and putting points on all our bugs. Lately, we've sort of fallen away from that, which I don't particularly love, but it's where our team is at the moment. So I think the short answer is, for at least the process stuff, we mostly don't track it. Like, I would say that 2/3 of the process things are really simple. Like, we'll start with this item at, like, we'll start with the list of priorities at the beginning of stand-up every day next week. It's like, that doesn't really take extra time per se. Or we'll ask for reviews in this different way, and then that takes somebody 15 minutes to set up in Bugzilla. So, and then the ones that do take time, we just sort of, we don't track it, and I think we would probably be in a better place if we did track more.
Can you share maybe an example of like an aha moment that came out of a retrospective that you may not have learned any other way?
I would say that the aha moment that's interesting for me is that more than once we had our team sort of rebooted organizationally. And the gnarliest one was where we just got, our boss was set aside and we were moved into a different organization. And this was run by people who had a very, very different, a very old school waterfall-y style process. And it wasn't an option to start with, to say, oh yeah, we're going to do all this agile stuff. Like that just, the people in the team were not capable of absorbing that, at least all in one piece. And so what we did was we said, well, the one thing we want to do is we want to do a weekly retrospective. And the thing that worked out so well about that is that we were able to effectively re-bootstrap all of our other processes from the retrospective. Because we were basically we were told, you will use this old school process and it's going to work this way. And at the end of the week, we discussed that and we'd be like, yeah, so that's not working very well. And what could we try? And of course, because we done this before, and we had some pretty good ideas about what we could try. And ultimately, our manager very much bought into this, and she was very impressed with it and tried to bring the other team she was working with some of those things as well. So like to me, it was just an overall, that's sort of what made me a convert into retrospectives. Like I'd always found them to be more valuable than most other meetings. And then that to me like really showed me a deeper power of some sort.
So in other words, like the retrospective itself was a
Yes.
useful tool to convert other people to agile in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at some level, I prefer to just talk about agile techniques, I think, just because so many people have had agile forced on them in ways that is highly dysfunctional, that to me the techniques are the more interesting pieces. Because the other thing I sort of learned with this is that the same techniques don't work for every team or even the same team over time.
So you've tweaked along the way.
Absolutely. I mean, we were using points and estimation a lot for quite a while, and then things changed in our context, and that became less desirable to various people for various reasons, and here we are. And I mean, whether or not it was the right call, it wasn't going to politically work, so we didn't have to try and pretend that it would and try and force it.
Any?
Well, thanks. I won't attempt to summarize that because that was a fair bit. But one thing that did remind me of, which is interesting, is that I realized that one of the biggest vectors for change is framing it in terms of small experiments. Because anytime you suggest, we're going to change this thing, that's big and scary because the people who imagine it as big and scary treat it as what they're imagining. And if you say, let's try this thing for a week, nobody gets too freaked out. So what I heard you say was that you like the idea of leaving questions on the table, and then I didn't catch the second part of that.
How do you handle the experiment that comes?
How do you handle the experiment that comes?
How do you assign people
Oh, I see. So in other words, we don't ask somebody, we leave it on the table. What happens to the experiment? I think it varies depending on sort of our various people in the room's feeling about the experiment, right? Like if our manager thinks we got to do this shit, he'll ask somebody to do it. Or he'll say, I'll take it and figure out what to do about it. And sometimes we just let it be, because one of the things that's nice about the puzzled question is that a lot of times, or I don't know if it's a lot of times, but certainly often enough, just this act of having brought something up and ruminating about it sort of as a group has a bunch of value, and it turns out to affect the way that we act afterwards. So sometimes the nature of problems changes based on just having had the discussion. And so it's often, I mean, one of the things that my friend William taught me about Agile too, is that one of the ways that you avoid over-managing stuff is to say, hey, if it's important, it'll come back.
It sounds like a key theme that you've touched on
Yes.
many times. Any other important questions? No? Dan, that was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. We still need to figure out how to share all that extra wisdom still residing in Dan's brain to your request. But we haven't figured that out. But Dan's Twitter account?
Is at Dmose, that's D-M-O-S-E.
So between
So
that
I will
and
tweet
forward.
that at some point.
Sweet.
Probably not this week because I have a deadline this week, and it's kind of exciting.
What are you learning?
A lot.
Woo! Thanks, you guys. Woo!
Thank you, everyone.